All right, getting us started here in chapter 1, just briefly hitting on a few concepts. We're not covering the whole chapter, just introducing some key concepts and some good terms that you'll need to know just to help in other chapters. So first of all, the major groups of microorganisms. So by definition, micro meaning small and organism meaning a thing, typically a living thing, though we'll talk about a couple exceptions. But essentially all these microorganisms are things that we can't see with the naked eye. So you have to have a microscope to see them. And there are 7 major groups of microorganisms. The first one, the one that we're most familiar with and probably what our brain goes to, is bacteria. And bacteria are prokaryotic. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the next slide. Also archaea or archaea. Again, also prokaryotic. We don't talk much about these in especially medical micro because very few of them cause disease. They are definitely important to microbiology. They're important to the environment. But as far as causing disease, that's not really where we're going to see these. And then fungi. So if you remember talking about these in your science classes, we think about like mushrooms or molds. But there are various organisms like athlete's foot that are caused by fungi. Now they are eukaryotic and usually multicellular, meaning made up of more than one cell, though yeast is the exception to that. So like a yeast infection, those are single-celled fungi. Then protozoa. So protists cause malaria, which is a huge problem, especially in Africa. It is also a eukaryotic organisms, but unlike fungi, most protists are single cell. So they exist as a single organism, much more like the bacteria and the archaea. And then the other eukaryotic are the helminths, and these are going to be the parasitic worms. So like a tapeworm, for example, or a fluke. Those are, again, eukaryotic. They are multicellular, again, think about a worm, and they are, again, parasitic, meaning they live off of food from a host. And then there are 2 that are still microorganisms, but they are not cellular, therefore they are considered non-living, but they definitely impact and can have significant impacts on life. And the main one here is viruses. So viruses are, again, they're not cells, they're not considered living. They're very simple. They have a protein coat that surrounds their nucleic acid, and that can be either DNA or RNA, but they are completely dependent on the host. So they can't reproduce on their own. They don't have a cell membrane. They're not considered a cell, therefore they're not considered living. And then our last one, prions. These are actually infectious proteins, which is really unique. But it's a protein in the brain that becomes misfolded, and then it can recruit or cause other proteins to misfold. So if you've heard of mad cow disease, it's caused by a prion. Now just a little bit about our cells. Again, bacteria and archaea, the prokaryotic cells, they are much smaller than the eukaryotic cells, but the main difference is that they lack organelles. So they don't have a nucleus. They don't have any bacteria, or they don't have any mitochondria, they don't have chloroplasts, they don't have things like that. So they just have their membrane, their double membrane, there's phospholipids that surround all their different structures. So they have DNA, some of them can perform photosynthesis, they can get energy the same way that mitochondria do. It's just everything happens inside of the cell and the cytoplasm. It doesn't have special little organelles for all of that. Whereas our eukaryotic cells, they do have organelles, so they have their cell membrane, cell membrane on the outside, but then they also have these small membrane-bound compartments, again, like especially the nucleus, but again, our mitochondria, where energy is made, and chloroplasts for photosynthesis. So again, they have these specialized organelles inside of the cell. Now, just a little bit more about the acellular, again, non-living microorganisms. So again, viruses, again, have a small amount of hereditary material. Again, it can be either DNA, but not both. And that's one of the differences between viruses and cells, is cells have both DNA and RNA. We need DNA for our genetic information. RNA helps us make our proteins and do other functions. But again, viruses have one or the other. So that's whatever it is, it's wrapped around a protein. Sometimes they can have an envelope that has some kind of lipid membrane, but it's different than a cell membrane. So again, these are not considered living. Again, they have very little genetic information because they only need what's special for them, because they completely take over the host cell and use their machinery. So they don't have to have genes to make enzymes for energy production because they just use the cells that they're infecting. So again, very small, very compact organisms. And then our last one, excuse me, those infectious proteins, the prions. Again, these are small proteins. Again, they're folded in such a way that they behave almost like a microorganism. So they, again, can kind of attack, they can move, they can kind of exist. But essentially what happens is, again, they recruit other proteins to become folded in the same way, which is not the way they're supposed to be folded, but it actually allows them to damage the host. It causes a lot of, it's all in the, with this protein is within the brain, so it causes a lot of problems. It's called spongiform encephalitis because it makes essentially holes in the brain of its recipients. And it can be transmitted from one human to another, or even from again, I'm mentioning mad cow disease. So even an infected brain tissue from a beef could be transmitted then to humans. So it can be transmitted and get infectious. All right, so again, just our 6 types of microorganisms. Again, there are 7. The archaebit is not pictured here. So again, just our helminths. Again, eukaryotic, multi-cells, but those are our parasitic worms. They don't all look like this. This is an example of a tapeworm, but there are other worms as well. Again, fungi, typically multicellular, all eukaryotic. The protists, again, these are single-celled, so this is a relatively large cell, but they're all single-celled organisms. Bacteria, so E. coli that's shown here, thinking about like, which is in our GI system, but it can't become a problem if we get contaminated. So again, fecal material becomes ingested and E. coli goes to different places. Viruses, again, just a single viral particle, so there's some kind of DNA or RNA in here, and then that protein coat surrounding it. And then finally, those infectious prions or proteins that are in there. And again, these are just proteins that are folded in a weird way that allows them to cause problems. All right, now some terminology. The first one here is pathogen. So we'll talk a lot about this throughout the semester. So a pathogen is any agent essentially that can cause disease. So again, this is medical micro, so that's mainly what we're focusing on. So again, it can be a virus, it can be bacteria, protists, again, all the ones that we just mentioned. Now, not all, just to highlight here, not all viruses, not all bacteria, not all fungi are pathogens. So that's why this term is provided. So it indicates a pathogenic virus is one that can cause disease. There are other viruses out there that don't cause disease. There are many, many, many bacteria that we need that are very beneficial. They don't cause disease. So they're bacteria, but they're not a pathogen. And there are actually about 2,000 different types of microbes that can cause disease. So of course, that's what we mainly think about, but there are more than that that do not cause disease. And then just a couple other terms here. So infectious, just meaning able to cause an infection, kind of implied there. And then also communicable. So communicable means it can be transmitted from one person to the other. So we think about a cold. So if somebody has a cold, they can infect essentially somebody else. So that's a communicable. It can be shared with another organism. Whereas others that don't cause disease, so again, non-pathogenic microbes, they are not infectious, meaning they don't cause an infection, so you can be exposed to them and nothing bad happens. And non-communicable, again, meaning it can't be transmitted from one organism to the other. All right. And whenever we look at some of these pathogens, these are the top causes of death, but all problems, all diseases. So the number 1 cause is heart disease, followed by cancer. So those are not directly caused by pathogens anyways. But if we see that 3 of them make this top causes of death. So COVID here, but then also influenza and pneumonia that are here as well. And then also even some respiratory diseases that can occur as a result of that as well. So again, these highly impact our human life. Now, whenever we take this to the world top causes of disease, we still see heart disease being the #1 cause. But then we see some different kind of statistics. So influenza and pneumonia becoming more significant. Again, COVID, though this number is thankfully starting to decrease. But then we also see some diarrheal diseases in other countries. So not so much a problem in the US leading to death, but definitely thinking about worldwide, these pathogens become more significant and more of an issue. All right, so just kind of finishing up here, looking at how we name organisms. So a few terms, again, nomenclature, that is a specific scientific name. So we are Homo sapiens, that's our nomenclature. That gives us a specific kind of category here to identify individual organisms. And organisms are also classified, which is an attempt to kind of orderly arrange organisms into different classes or categories. And then identification is just the process of discovering and recording the traits so they can be recognized or named in one and given a specific name or nomenclature and classified into one of those categories. So identifying and placing them into their correct place. And then just a little bit more here about the nomenclature. So the scientific name uses a binomial, so two names system. So it's a combination of the genus name and the species name. The genus name is always capitalized, and that's the first one, while the species name, the second name, is always a lowercase. Now, both of them should always be italicized when in print, or if you're handwriting, they would be underlined because it's hard to write in italics. So they're underlined if we're writing just freehanded. Now, abbreviations can be used for the genus name only, just to save space, but that's only after it has already been stated. So for example, if we're writing a sentence and we're talking about Staphylococcus aureus, and then we go on to a sentence a couple sentences later, then the genus name Staphylococcus can be abbreviated, but the species name is always included because that's the specific name that allows it to be identified. But again, just to save some time and some space after the genus name is used, it can be abbreviated. But again, just looking correctly at how to correctly write the scientific name. Let me get rid of this. So again, the genus name comes first. So Staphylococcus is the genus name in this scenario. So again, it is capitalized. Then the species name is second, and it is lowercase. But both of them are italicized because, of course, we're here in print. But if we were writing it, we would just underline it to identify that it's a scientific name.